Dale Clemens is a fisherman, well-known author, lecturer, and consummate rod crafter. In this advanced tape on rod crafting, Dale will show you how to wrap your own decorative and intricate thread designs, and how to build a more distinctive handle to make your fishing rod a beautiful and unique work of art.
Hi, I'm Dale Clemens. A person often builds his first rod because he perhaps would like to try and save some money, or to get a rod that he otherwise can't get, or because he feels he can build a better rod than is commonly available. And if, when he builds that first rod, he pays careful attention to the things that rod companies can't do and that he can do, he'll find out that it's true what we said on our first tape and what I've been preaching for years, and that is that you can build a better rod than you can buy. And once he's proved that to himself, it's as exciting as it is rewarding. He really has fun. He's making rods. He wants to make more of them. He'd probably like to build a rod that's finely tuned for each of his own specific fishing needs. And then, too, there are friends and relatives for whom he'd like to build rods. So it's an exciting thing for him to do. Rod performance is primary at that point, and it'll continue forever to be the important part of his rod building. With his willingness to do the hand fitting of the parts in making that rod, combined with his choice of very high quality components, he'll find that he can build better performing rods almost right off the bat, and certainly without spending years as an apprentice in the job. Now that's kind of amazing, really, but it's true nevertheless. And if a person were to need any conviction on that part, all he needs to do is look to the rod company or factory system for building rods. It's very labor intensive. There are no such things as automatic rod building machines. And the rod companies cannot take the time to go out and test cast each rod that they make, or to run a stress distribution test to find out where to place the guides. So our novice rod builder will find that he can make better performing rods. And he'll get better as he builds more rods, there's no doubt about it. But interestingly, one of the areas where he'll improve the most is in his ability to be analytical and find out what he needs to do to make that rod, custom rod, just the way he wants it, to get the performance that he wants out of it. And we hit a key word. We said custom. And custom implies something unique in observable craftsmanship. And since it does, our custom rod builder wants his rods to look good, to look better, to look different. Because he's building a better instrument, fishing instrument, better rod. Therefore, when someone picks it up, before they've even had a chance to see how well it performs, he'd like them to know that, hey, this is unique, this is different, this looks like the work of art that it really is, that he's created. And that's why rod builders are concerned with trying to create things, to beautify the rod, so to speak. In other words, anything that they can do to this rod that's creative and that's artistic will make it look better, and therefore it'll better fit that definition of custom. And as we'll see, that's basically what we're going to talk about on this particular tape. We'll focus our attention in two areas. One, the handles. And we'll talk about function, but we're going to principally talk about the things that can be done to enhance the beauty. The other thing we'll talk about on this tape will be the decorative butt wraps that have for so long been used as a way of expressing one's creativity and adding beauty to the rod. Starting with the handles, the key to good custom handle design is to first determine the function of the handle part specifically, but as well as the whole rod. And then to fit the dimensions to that function as well as to the person who's going to use the rod. Simply stated, the handle's got to fit the guy that's going to fish it, and it's got to fit the job for which it's intended to do. That's what custom really is all about. We don't want to copy factory rods, because a factory approach is to try and design and build a rod that fits and appeals to everyone. And that's impossible. People come in all sizes and shapes. What we want to do as custom rod builders is build a specific rod designed for a specific kind of fishing to be used by a specific fisherman. And by definition, that automatically becomes a better performing fishing instrument. In addition, as we said, we're concerned with the appearance of the handle now that we're talking about handles. It should reflect the skill and the craftsmanship that we have, and it should be unique. And handles are therefore important to custom rod builders for not only the functional aspect, but for the cosmetic or the beauty aspect as well. Since you already know the basics of how to assemble a handle, we're not going to spend any time on that. We're going to concentrate on beauty-enhancing techniques and materials that you can use to make your rods look better. Oh sure, we're going to throw in some things about function and some ideas that we have on that, but a lot of the functional parts of this handle design will really have to come from you and your analysis of the rod that you're building and designing. I think you'll see what we mean as we get into it a little further. An excellent material for customizing any rod that has cork grips is burnt cork material. It not only shapes like cork and in all other respects handles like it, but particularly important is it feels like cork. And that means that you can use it in any handheld grips. And probably the most handheld grip used is a fly rod grip, but there are some foregrips that also, on saltwater rods or for heavier fish, that your hand is on frequently. Because the burnt cork feels the same, you can put it anywhere you want on that grip. When we're talking about fly rod grips, we said we'd try and relate some of the functional aspects, and let me go off on a couple of thoughts here. First off, fly rod grips should fit the person's hand. It sounds very obvious, but yet you go to buy a factory rod, and either they're all the same of a given rod length, or you'll find that the grips get a little bit fatter and a little bit longer. As you get up to the bigger rods for 9-weight and 10-weight lines, and you get down to the 4-weight rods, then the grips are skinny and smaller. I suppose that's to give them a more delicate feel when you pick them up in the store. But the grip should fit the person's hand, and it doesn't matter whether I've got a 4-weight rod or if I've got a 9-weight rod in my hand, I need the same size grip. So it's one very important thing you can do as a custom rod builder is make that grip fit. Now the other idea that I want to share is that you can carry fitting too far, and you can get into a grip that you start to customize to the point where there are indents for the fingers. I think maybe you've seen some of these. They're quite custom fitted. Well, they really start to defeat the purpose, because in a day's casting, and the fly fisherman all day is casting and working that rod, what he does to relieve pressure is start to move his hand a little bit on the rod grip. It's imperceptible, but he's using different muscles in his hands, and he's relieving pressure. That's what keeps him from getting tired. Now you build a grip so constricting that he can't do that. He really can't move his fingers around. He's going to cramp up very quickly and be very tired. Okay, let's go back to the cosmetic aspects of working with burnt cork. One of the nice things that you can do with burnt cork is to make these checkerboard inlays, such as we have here. Now, I don't mean to bypass just the inlaying of the trim rings, because they themselves can be very handsome and give a very nice appearance to any grip. But we want to talk on this tape about some of the more intricate techniques, such as checkerboards. I have it here on this fly rod grip. You see checkerboards here on this spinning handle. And back here, I have a rod that is also a checkerboard, but you'll notice the thickness of the rings that is used are narrower or thinner, and therefore you get a different effect on the checkerboard. It's more compressed, a little more subtle. So you can be creative and do different things with checkerboards. They're not all the same by a long shot. One of the problems some people face in the beginning is saying, well, how am I going to cut these and make them into the pieces that fit? And really, it's not very difficult, and I'll share with you in a minute a few ideas that I've used over the years. But just so we understand basically how a checkerboard is made, it is cut into 8 equal segments. You do it on a burnt cork ring and a white cork ring, as these pieces show here. And then you alternate them, as you see here, and glue them together. What you want to make sure is that the 2 rings, the white cork and the burnt cork, are the same thickness. Now, you might have cut them from a piece of burnt cork like this, such as a grip, or a stick of burnt cork, or you might have purchased them as rings. But to check and make sure they are the same thickness, put them aside of each other, put your finger right there, and you'll feel immediately if there's the slightest difference. And they do need to be the same. Okay, the way I've cut grips, I've had some very fancy tools, and here's one of them. Couldn't be much more simple, and it works very well. And what it is, a piece of cardboard, and I've put a 1 1/8 inch circle, which is the size of cork rings. And the inside I have a 3/8 inch circle to represent a 3/8 inch hole. That's the most common size I have used at the time I devised this. And then I drew carefully and laid out my radial lines. Now, to do this, I take a cork ring and I put it on there, and I get my head above it so that I can look down and get it perfectly lined up, that I can't see any of the ring on either side. Now, I could take and draw the lines, but I find it works best if I take a thin saw like this X-Acto saw and just hold this, put this here, and simply score the cork. All I need to do is, again, look down from the top and make sure that my saw is in a straight line, lined up with those radial lines that I've drawn, and score back and forth. And in doing that, I've got my cork ring marked. Now I can set my little tool aside, and I can either cut through the ring with a saw, or on a thin ring like this, I might want to use a blade, an X-Acto blade like this, or a single-edge razor blade, whichever is more convenient. I find the razor works well on thin rings, but on thick rings, if I'm going to cut those, then the saw works best. I used this for many years, and then I had a machinist friend make me this tool. And it allowed me to, well, I'll show you how this works from underneath here. There's a little piece of cardboard goes in so that I can poke this out afterwards. Plastic over here. You put the ring in, and now I can actually take the saw, and with these grooves, I can cut the cork. I can just come right on down and actually cut the wedges. You have to be a little careful as you get towards the end that the pieces aren't getting too small, that they're starting to fall apart. But it's surprisingly easy if you just use the tip of your left index finger to hold them. So those are 2 ways of cutting the rings. And just recently, we came up with still another, and this is a little plastic PVC tool, which we've carefully had these slots machined, and we put the cork in. But we don't use this for cutting. We use it just for scoring. You just put this in here, and again, like we did with the paper template, just score the cork where necessary, then take it out and cut it. All right, now that we have our cork cut into these little pieces here, the gluing, I have used 5-minute epoxy for a long time because we're not really talking about any structural significance on this small checkerboard. I wouldn't advocate 5-minute epoxy for gluing a handle together. But I used wax paper because I'm going to use my hands as the clamp with the 5-minute epoxy. And if we start with a ring such as this, cork ring, and build upon it. Now I put one of these little thin trim rings on, burnt rings on first, and then I took the individual pieces, took a spatula, first speared some 5-minute epoxy on, then working quickly, put the pieces on. You might find, as I have, that a tweezers helps you in laying these in place for while you're trying to work quickly with that 5-minute epoxy. When you get them in place and alternated, then just take your wax paper and bend it down around the top. You can see through it, which is nice, and you can use a number of fingers on two hands, and you have a perfect clamp. And just hold it together for the couple of minutes that remains that with a 5-minute epoxy to set up. And it's all glued together. Now by doing that, you really can prefab a number of these little units. And you can have some checkerboards made up beforehand of different thicknesses and sizes and configurations. And then all you need to do when you're ready to build a rod is treat those just like you would a cork ring. Just stick them on, whether you're doing it on the rod handle or making a preformed grip. Another thing that you can do with cork is make some triangles, as I call this kind of configuration here. But you're not limited to triangles. Any kind of template that you can devise that will enable you to cut pieces of burnt cork and white cork and then subsequently fit them together, you've got a great tool. You now have a building block to work with. Let me show you what I mean with these triangles. This tool has a V in it, and I won't put a cork ring in because I think you can see it better without. But if we take the X-Acto saw and lay it right along the edge and saw down, keeping it against that edge, we'll get a nice perfect cut on that side template, and we do the same over here. And what you'll get is like this. This is a burnt cork ring that's just been cut like that, and there's my triangle, and there's the piece that it came from. These pieces sitting over here, I simply did a white cork one and put in the brown cork and vice versa. Now, remember I said building blocks? It's kind of like when we were kids. Well, you can do a lot of interesting things and have some fun. Let's say we took these just as you see them sitting here, and we, well, first let's do it like this. Okay? There, you get an idea just looking at it at what that might look like on a grip. Or you might say, well, let's go for a reverse effect here. And we'll put these like this and have kind of a harlequin effect. See? Now I have the dark and the light alternating. Very nice effect. The possibilities are very broad and very creative. In fact, I've got a rod back here on the rack, fly rod, where I did this. You'll see on the bottom is the thin cork ring from which I cut out the triangles, and then I took the triangles and put those in a white cork ring and glued it right above. Now you notice they're on 4 axes. All you do is after you've glued 2 of them together, like suppose we had this glued together and it's now dry, put it back in the tool, this time at this angle, and then cut it again. And that gives you 4 axes instead of just 2. So creative work can really be done with burnt cork, and it's so creative I suggest that the best thing that I can suggest to you is that you go out and get yourself some burnt cork and try cutting it up and gluing it back together again, and you'll be surprised at some of the interesting creative handles that you can make. There's an unmistakable warmth and charm about polished wood that really adds beauty to almost any rod, especially custom wood, which is a wood that's made up, these are pieces of it in the raw state, of many, many layers of veneer totally impregnated with resin. So it never needs any finish. All you do is buff it to provide the finish. And many uses in rods, but for example, let's take these skeleton fly seats here. If they became scratched, and it was regular wood, I have to go to the trouble of refinishing them. But with custom wood, all I need to do is take a buffing wheel to them and just buff them up. If it's a really deep scratch, I might have to sand it a little bit first. So I like to use that particular wood. If you prefer working with other kinds of wood, I'd suggest you use an exterior kind of finish like a gunstock finish to keep the things from weathering poorly. Skeleton seats have long employed wood on fly rods and some spinning rods, but wood hasn't been used except by a few custom rod builders and in recent years. And what you can do is you can take the skeleton seat that has the wood in it, and you can pick up the wood on the grip itself. For example, on a fly rod, we have to be concerned with just where the hand touches, and that's all cork. But down here at the base of the grip, we can use some wood that was exactly the same as we used in the grip there, in the real seat there. While we're up here on the rack, let's look at some of the other functional and also functional applications of wood. All the way on this end, I have my tarpon rod, which is for an 11 weight to 12 weight line, and it's 9 foot long. Now, that tends to be rather heavy in the hand, the tip heavy. And one of the ways that I've made that counterbalanced a little bit is I've used a very heavy piece of burl walnut in the back on the fighting butt. Fighting butts are important on those kinds of rods because you got to play a big fish, and you're going to take that rod and push it into your stomach, and you want to hold the reel away so you can turn it. Now, I've also picked up that same wood here with a trim ring. Let's look at the next. This is a steelhead rod, and the reel seat happens to be designed this way, but it has a little bit of a short fighting butt. You can easily add that on a rod. Here I didn't need the extra weight, and so it was cork. This one is an even lighter rod, and I wanted to get the reel away a little bit from my body in case it's a trout rod that I'm turning the reel and I don't want to have the reel catch in my shirt. So I used an uplocking seat. Now let me talk about uplocking and downlocking seats for a minute, and we'll use this seat right here. If we put the seat on the rod in this configuration, the reel sits down into it. We screw this down and it becomes a downlocking seat. The seat is as far away from the hand as possible. And that would be a good thing to do if we wanted to add weight out here at the end. On the other hand, if it was a very light rod with a very light reel, which we're encountering with today's graphite rods and correspondingly lighter reels, then I can get a better balance if I move the reel up a little bit closer to the fulcrum, which is my hand. And I use then an uplocking seat. Just take the same seat and mount it in that direction. Now the reel is up this way. So uplocking and downlocking, besides being cosmetic, have some very functional uses. We were mentioning counterbalancing, and you'll find if you build many saltwater rods or heavy freshwater rods, and I'm thinking now of spinning rods, that, let me just grab a spinning handle here, that you sometimes will have a rod that with a day's fishing, particularly if it's a lot of casting, such as with jigs and jerking, that your hand will tire right in here. It's being pulled down, and what's pulling it is excessive tip weight on the rod. And the best way to solve that is to add weight, not to try and take any off there, because you really can't. And just take and remove the butt cap, or when you're building it and you anticipate this, put some lead in here. Small amount, and just enough till you feel that you've started to get a more normal balance, and that'll relieve that tremendous pressure across the hand here. So wood can be used as a counterbalance. I could, on a spinning rod, for example, use a very heavy butt cap and then put a heavy piece of wood right next to it. Makes a nice cosmetic appearance, but it adds some weight back here to counterbalance things. Looking at spinning rods, or talking about spinning rods, I have this in my hand, I'm reminded of what I think is a very functional and a very good-looking kind of handle, and that is bracketing the reel seat with two pieces of wood or wood and plastic. And it's functional because cork has a tendency over a period of time to chip and sometimes then crumble and break out. And generally it's the edges, of course, of the cork that do that. And by substituting wood trim in there, I've eliminated that possibility of the cork breaking off. I've also, since I've used a skeleton seat with the same wood in the center, I've got a real good looking, I think anyway, handle that makes the metal look like it's laid onto the wood. Good way of doing something functional and cosmetic. You'll find in spinning rods also that you frequently get into certain kinds of rods with very long butts. And when the butt is very long, it's a good idea to break up some of those lines with some wood or plastic or combination trim. And let me cite some of the rods particularly that I'm thinking about. A steelhead rod, for example. If this were a steelhead rod that I had in my hand, most steelhead fishermen like to have, with their hands on the seat, to have the grip come all the way to the elbow. Now I've got short arms, 32-inch sleeve. People with longer arms would have even longer grip. And that's a long, uninterrupted section that could be broken up with some trim, as I've done on this particular handle there. Another example would be fighting rods, rods designed for fighting, where I'm going to be bracing the rod into my stomach or into a belt that I might be wearing for that purpose. And now, functionally, I have to make sure that the reel seat is at a comfortable position for the person who's going to fish it to turn the reel. Okay? That normally will leave a rather long butt. Another long butt rod is a surf rod. Here I want to fit it to where the reel seat goes, but down further at the end of the butt, that distance between has to fit the grip that the man uses in casting. He's going to be pulling with his left hand and pushing with his right, and he has a certain comfortable feel for him. We need to fit that to him, but we're going to be left with a long butt grip. Now in surf rods, sometimes it's purposefully left split to break the lines up. That is, there'll be a short grip here and a short butt grip down here and just the blank decorated with thread. But I think a different approach, since we've seen so much of that, is to use cork the whole way or resilient material and insert some wood. A rod that is a fighting rod that normally in a saltwater situation is stuck into the holder on a boat has a long butt. And it's another interesting thing. It has a collar here, a place where it's going to chafe on the rod holder. I think we've all seen that. Well, what better place than to use this custom wood as a trim ring? Because as it mars, gee, all you have to do is take it in and buff it, and you're back to where you were new. So maintenance is a snap. Cork would break out and crumble. Resilient grips start to wear. It's about the best way I found to solve that problem and have a good-looking rod in the process. Talking about fighting rods, if you're building an offshore trolling rod, you normally build a pretty long grip because the fellow is fighting the fish here and he's got a hold of this grip and he's using that to pump the fish and so on. He's not looking at the rod. He's looking out there where the fish is jumping, if it's a marlin or a sailfish, and he's doing what the captain's telling him to, and he's sweating and working pretty hard. And my point is this: if you take on that long grip, put a wood trim ring at each end, you now have a non-visual indicator. As his hand comes back too far, he'll start to feel the wood underneath it. And if it comes up here, he'll feel the wood. Now, why is that important? Leverage. He's going to get more leverage on the rod up here than he is down here. At times he wants to put a lot of leverage on. He wants to know he's up here. Other times he wants to know he's down here. And since these grips are often 12 or 14 inches long, having those indicators can be very, very helpful. Another good place to use wood trim rings. They're a certain kind of rod that for years always seemed to look alike, and that was a casting rod, because the handle is a manufactured product that's pretty much just chucked on, and even the manufacturers got to make the handles look an awful lot alike. And that was an open invitation for custom rod builders, of course, to try and do something cosmetically. But they also have done some very unique functional things. Now, it's really very simple. You take this Fuji handle, and all you have to do is take a razor blade and slit it right down like that, and off comes your resilient coating. And on this, sometimes you'll find two kinds, some that are tapered and some that are round. If it's tapered, you can do a little filing or scraping away. But now you have a piece onto which you can build anything you want. Now let's look at some of the things you can do. Here's a nice wood pistol grip. Fits the hand, but look, you see? If you're good with woodworking, you just take a block of wood, drill it out to fit the size of the shaft there, and then shape it with a Dremel tool or on a sanding disc or with files or rasps, whatever you want to get the fit that you want, and then just take some epoxy glue and put it in place. These other two handles were made the same way. This kind of stag-like look was achieved by taking a Dremel tool with a little bird end drilling kind of bit on it and just making horizontal passes, just distressing the wood. And you end up with a kind of a stag effect. When you put some stain in, it goes into the darker portion. This always reminds me of pipes. I used to smoke a pipe for years, and the burl effect that's on some pipes. You see, it's smooth where the fingers and the hand goes, but all the other portions have this figured, I just call it a pipe figure. And what you do is take the round little drill ball on the end of a Dremel tool and just bounce it, like that, and that leaves those little dimpled marks. Very attractive. Draws a lot of nice comments. Most people enjoy having a rod of that type. But all of those are just, we're still kind of back to pistol type of grips. Many times you'd like to have a longer grip, a longer casting handle that could be used for two-handed casting, get that extra leverage of pulling with the left hand and pushing with the right, and also one that's more comfortable to brace against your stomach and reel with. Well, this one is made on a piece of aluminum, just like this, which fits onto the shaft. In fact, I can take it off and show you. This goes on like that, and then the resilient grip material is custom grip that goes on here, and I've used custom wood or any kind of wood that you wanted down here, and we used some of these plastic rings, two white and a black, that went in here to try and repeat the theme that Fuji originally put on its handle. You can use any kind of material. Here's an even longer grip made again on an aluminum tube that would fit on there, make a good saltwater handle, but offset. You might say, well, why don't you just build it on the rod? Well, you look at this handle's offset. The blank would come in like this, and this is at a different angle. And that's important for casting and handling for people that are used to casting rods. Some don't like that through the handle construction. So here we've got a two-handed candle of cork. We have a nice butt cap on the end that's comfortable, that rolls against one's belt or belly when he's fighting a fish. Good way to take a handle, modify it functionally as well as cosmetically. As far as any particular fabricating techniques, you'll notice that a lot of times I've used a piece of wood or custom wood with black brackets. Well, those black brackets are nothing more than taking one of these trim rings and a couple of plastic rings. You can buy the plastic rings, or you can take a hole saw and cut them out of a sheet of plexiglass. And that's what that is. You can see it right there. In the raw state, that is before it's been turned, and here these in the front have been turned and shaped. All you need to do is take the pieces and roughen the edges. Whenever you glue things, we learned a long time ago, you need to roughen them up. Take some very coarse paper, just protect the very edge so you're not coming out and scarring the edge that'll show. But take that coarse paper and rub it around on the ring so as to scar it up. Do the same thing on the custom wood ring. And that way you'll get a better glue bond when you put epoxy on them and put them together and clamp them and let them dry. I could just as soon bracket this with blue or with white or whatever I wanted, and that little bit of blue could be repeated in blue wraps on the rod. Really look nice. Okay, when you're making a handle like that, where you're going to insert some pieces of wood, I suggest that you do this. You take the wood and you put it on a mandrel to shape it, and you shape it first. Develop the contour and the shape that you want. Now you've got to visualize ahead what it's going to be like on the rod. You see, you don't need anything fancy. This is a steel mandrel wrapped with masking tape. I've bushed out enough of a bushing here so that that piece of wood will fit tightly on there. All I need to do is take that and chuck it into my lathe, or if you're still using the drill that we mentioned on our first tape, put it in the drill, and now I can shape it. And I could use lathe tools such as this if I had them, or I could use files or coarse sandpaper and just work it down to finer sandpaper. And once I have these pieces, let's say we have a couple of these, and if this were going to be my handle, I'd take my tapered piece that I wanted to get the curve and I'd put it up here, glue it on along with the cork rings, and the more straight piece I'd glue in the back on the butt grip. Now we have all these rings glued up, and I can put it in my lathe and turn the cork rings down to the dimensions of the hard material and blend in the lines. It's a good idea if you're going to do that to protect your wood with a layer of masking tape and then peel it off. And if you're worried about the final finish, use one of these emery boards. Your wife probably has them already, and if this were down already, I can just take that without turning the lathe, use this as a tool or a rod rest, and just file that in very carefully and blend the edges in. So those are really all the fabricating techniques, and if you've worked with wood before, you may have some better ideas and things that you could share. But I would suggest you consider two things on the wood and the hard plastic. One is the functional use. Where would that wood really make sense to use it on the rod? And then secondly, how can I do it so that it really is warm and pleasing and beautiful? I think you'll have fun with it. Some of the most popular grips in recent years have been made from resilient grip materials. The particular material you see here is called Custom Grip 2, and it's a closed cell foam that's fairly firm. It's rugged, it won't chip like cork is sometimes prone to do. It's comfortable in the hand. It's obviously rather bright. You can do a lot of things color-wise, and it weighs about the same as cork, so it has a lot of advantages. It has one other unique advantage as well, and that is that it was formulated so that it could be shaped by the home craftsman. And this enables you to do a lot of things with it rather than just using preformed shaped grips. Let's take a look at what you'd need to do some shaping. I have a rod lathe here which has a live center, ball bearing center on this end, and I have a tool rest back here, and the piece of grip material is mounted onto a steel mandrel, such as we've used for some other things. Now you could shape this material on any number of lathes, a wood lathe, a metal lathe, or even a homemade lathe rig that you would devise yourself. I would say there are a couple of things that you need to keep in mind. One is you need either high speed or torque. In this case, I'm going for the speed. I have a little sewing machine motor here that turns out about 5,000 RPM no load. A bigger motor would provide more torque, and you could use that instead. The other important criteria for your lathe setup is something that will hold the mandrel steady so that there'll be no whipping or vibration. Otherwise, the grip obviously would be out of shape. You should shape your resilient grips off of the rod on a mandrel, or you can use a piece of scrap blank. Here's one that I use, and you see I have some masking tape on the end, and I just push the grip onto that. But do it off the rod because it's much easier then to put the shaped grip onto the blank itself. There's less material needed to be stretched. Okay, do your final shaping if you have a rod lathe just to blend into hubcap or to butt caps and things like that with very, very fine sandpaper. All right, let's take a look at how you might shape this material. For the square material, I would use a lathe tool or a chisel. This, I think, is called a skew. Some of you woodworkers can possibly correct me, but I'm going to use this held on the tool rest so that this edge here is parallel with the face of the grip material. Before I do that, if I were shaping variegated material, which is what gives us the wood grain effect. This material comes in extruded form. It's round, has kind of a tough skin on the outside, and you start your shaping with a very, very coarse paper, 20 grit, open coat. Okay, first I have a foot pedal for my lathe here, and we'll take off this outer square configuration. Just bring it along, trying to knock off those four corners and try to convert your piece of grip material down to a cylinder, to a round configuration. I have to take a little more off of that yet. Okay, once you have it to a cylinder, then go for your rough shaping to an open coat paper. This is 40 grit. And I'll use this to develop my basic shape. Now this is just to get the rough shaping. Not concerned with final texture or finish. Just to complete the rounding off process. And develop any rough shapes. I'm going to stop periodically and see how you're coming, how it's rounding up. And if I were going to develop contours in here back and forth, I would do that at this point. Develop a taper if I wanted a taper down here on this end. Now that I have the rough shape, I'm going to switch to this paper, which is 80 grit. And anywhere from 80 to 100, 120 will work fairly well here. And this is to put the basic final finish onto the grip material. And just as you shape cork, you just keep working on this till you get the exact kind of finish that you want. Starting to shape up, finish up pretty nicely. I'm going to round the edges off now. And you'll see when you're rounding the edges that you have to be careful you don't go too quickly, because those corners come off rather quickly. All right, now that we have a basic grip, we could just take it off and use it that way, but let's look at some of the things we can do with it. One thing, if we wanted to, for decorative purposes, we could cut in some little V-grooves. And I have here a triangular file, which I can either use directly, or I could take and fold some sandpaper over it, make it a little bit wider if I like, and rest the file on the tool rest in the back, and then lower the file onto the revolving grip. And just rock the file a little bit. You don't want to cut too deeply, obviously. And it puts a nice little ring or line in there. These look best, as do many pieces of trim, in threes. Another thing that I can do is I can actually make parts on here. For example, suppose I wanted a little winding check out of blue to use on a cork grip. Well, I've got the makings of a winding check right there. All I need to do is slice it off, and I'm using any kind of a blade. This one happens to be a little X-Acto blade. I'm just going to feed that in there. That's like that. See if I can pull that off to the side a bit for you. And there's a little winding check. You can get a better idea of what these might look like right here. Cut them to the size you want and glue them up just as you would a winding check with your cork handles. Or if I wanted a hosel, I could cut one perhaps off of this end, but a larger piece like this, again, build the contours so they fit in with the cork, and I now have a black or whatever color hosel that I want. All the inlays that we've seen in this beautiful Custom Grip 2 are done with making trim rings. These are the building blocks. And to cut your trim rings, what you need to have is a source or a method so that each trim ring is exactly the same thickness as another. Now, this is a little adjustable bi-cutter used in the graphic arts industry. And you can, by turning these two screws, vary the width of these two little sharp blades. And I can set it to whatever width I want and use that on the tool rest to not cut the whole grip, or cut the trim ring, but to start it. Here's a homemade one. Happens to be very wide, but all you do to make your own is take a piece of very stiff material, plastic, metal, wood, whatever, the thickness you want, take two X-Acto blades, wrap them on, much as you would if you were wrapping a guide onto a rod, and use epoxy glue and let it cure well for a few days before you use it. And that can be used to score this so that you get repeatedly the exact same thickness. Now let me show you with this one. We'll cut out a trim ring and you can see what I mean. All I've done is start the cut. Now I'm going to take and finish the cut with the individual blade. That goes in and I cut all the way till I feel the blade against the mandrel on the inside. And there I've got a ring of that thickness right there. And I could cut repeatedly as many as I liked and they'd all come out the same. The stuff does tend to cling to you, so it's good to have a brush or a vacuum cleaner handy. All right, let's look at some of the things that we can do with these rings. I said they're the building blocks, and you can see the various inlays that we have. In front of me here is a black grip that I've cut in the two parts, as you can see, and I want to insert in it 3 trim rings, the 2 gray and the 1 red. Excuse me. Now, what you have to remember to use with resilient grip materials is a contact cement. You cannot use any kind of cement such as epoxy because it'll give you a hard glue line which would ruin the total effect. You want this, after it's glued together, to be just as resilient as it was before, and contact cement will do that. I would caution you, use only runny or thin, less viscous contact cements, and use always fresh contact cement. If you have some around the house that you used last year, don't use it now on these grips. The way I do it is I take a piece of Scotch tape and put it sticky side up, and then I take and hold it in place with 2 pieces of tape down on the ends. That enables me to, after I've spread glue on the face of the ring, to set it there just like that, and it won't fall over and smear the glue. With contact cement, you apply the glue and you let the pieces set for at least 20 minutes. I'd suggest that since contact cement, as soon as it touches, it grabs and there's no sliding, that you take a piece of scrap blank or a dowel or something to help you align the parts. For example, I'm going to take this and put this on like this, and now I'll take the first of my rings here and I'm going to slip it down. In this case it's very large and I can use the outside of my fingers somewhat as an alignment point, but as soon as it touches, that's it. I can't move it after that. And I'd take the red ring, do the same, bring it in, get it aligned just before I have it touch, touch. And don't worry about some slight irregularities here because they'll be taken care of when you sand it. The same with the hole. The little bit of difference here on this section isn't going to matter a darn. Now we take the last piece and bring this down. I'm going to move this one up a little. Bring them together and press them. Now here's an important tip to you. Anything and everything that you can do to smash these parts together, however brief, however momentary, will substantially increase that bond. And so if I hit it, pound it like this, if I had a vise, I might try and put it in a vise and squash it. A drill press, I might stick it up there and use the drill press to squash it. Anything, hammers, your fingers, just press it together as tightly as you can, just briefly. And that will make a bond that's probably 4 times stronger than if you just stick it together. And that's ready to go. I can, if I want, take a blade and trim some of that roughly off before I start sanding, and then I would sand and develop the shape that I want in particular for that grip. You can also make checkerboards with this arrangement. And you see here a lovely checkerboard of red and black into gray, and here are the parts. And there's nothing new to you here. We've already talked about making checkerboards under burnt cork grips, and it's done the same way. Use the same tools to cut from the trim rings that you've made the little pie-shaped wedges, and then glue these together on another ring. This time you'll be using contact cement, and therefore you'll want to use probably a pair of pliers, or excuse me, a little, here's what I was looking for, a little pair of forceps or something that you can lay them in carefully and not have a problem, because you cannot move them once you've touched the two pieces together. But don't worry about the irregularities, because once you sand it in, it'll take care of it. There's another trick, if we want to talk about tricks per se, that you can use. It's really just a nice touch, and that is these plugs, or round, what'll look like round contrasting colors in the grip. And to cut these plugs, you don't need anything very fancy, just some tubing, brass tubing that you can get in hobby stores, but it must be of sizes that'll fit inside each other. You notice this one piece fits exactly inside the other. And you can get a whole range of sizes. Cut off a piece of that, like this, take it, chuck it in your lathe or your drill, and hold a file against the one end a little bit so that it's made sharp. Now, let me show you here. We're going to take, you have two pieces that fit inside each other. We're going to make our hole with the smallest of the two pieces. And I've already chucked it into the drill. And all we would do would be just push it in like that. I think it's, yep. There it is. And now I might want to remove this. Well, you can see it when it's popped out from the inside. It's another advantage of the short pieces. We take this and just push it out. There's a plug we cut, but we don't want to use that plug. We want to make our plug from the next largest size of tubing. That will make it such that there's just a perfect fit. If anything, it'd be slightly oversized and will squeeze together. So we have our hole. Now we want to cut the plug. We want to put a blue plug inside the gray grip. Oh, thought maybe I could pick it out, but I can't. I'll have to take it out of there. And you'll see I now have a nice blue plug that I can put into that gray hole. Let me suggest something here, and that is we want to use resilient glue, contact cement, to keep it nice and resilient. And if we put glue in there and on there and try and join them, it's not going to work. They're going to stick. So put your coat of glue in the hole and on the plug, let them dry for the typical 20 minutes for contact cement. Then take, and just before you put this piece in, put a little glue on the plug. Then take the plug and stick it in place. And you see, that's very rough, but that's all we need at this point. My plug would be in there. I would then let it dry at least overnight, because that contact cement has to evaporate. And when I sand it down, it'll come out just as smooth as those other ones that you saw there. So really, there are a lot of different things that you can do with this material. There's still one other possibility. Hopefully you won't ever really need to do it, but it can be taper-reamed from the inside. That is, enlarge the hole. Now, as you know, we need a smaller hole than the size of the blank to mount the grip on, and we stretch that material as we slide it down on epoxy. There could be a situation, however, sometime when you had a very, very small hole and a very, very large blank, and that's the only thing you had. Using the tapered reamer, a file won't work, but a tapered reamer with very coarse grit on it, you can ream the inside out. This is nothing more than some very stiff plastic that I've fashioned here, cut a slit in. You could use thin wall PVC just as well. The idea is it helps keep the grip straight as I ream it. Put it in there, insert the reamer in the hole, and just sand back and forth like you would with cork. It's not going to come off quite as quickly as cork, but you can see some of the material is coming out. So it is a possibility. It might bail you out of a tough situation at some future date. Well, we've really covered quite a bit on this tape so far on the variety of different kind of handles that you can make and handle materials that you can work with. We've talked about burnt cork, about wood and plastic as inserts and inlays into the grips, and now we've talked about resilient grip material and some of the techniques that can be used. So it's up to you at this point. We've given you some ideas, we've given you some techniques. Now the creative part is the fun part, and that's up to you.